Hi, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural session of the Digital Health Summer Speaker Series. My name is Claire Payton. I'm the program manager at the UVA initiative TYDE, which stands for Thriving Youth in a Digital Environment, and I'm also the organizer of this series. So the reality is that youth today are developing in an increasingly digital world. TYDE operates on the principle that we must understand this impact and leverage young people's digital engagement to expand access to mental health care through innovative digital interventions. That's why we encourage the next generation of research talent to consider careers in the digital mental health industry. In addition to the speaker series, TYDE's also running a remote summer internship program, which has placed 10 graduate students in short-term positions with both established and startup digital health companies. Collaborating with therapists in tech to bring you this series was a natural next step. Therapists in tech have been leading in career development opportunities in this field for several years. Tim Campellone, a clinical scientist designing health products at Apple, is an advisor to therapists in tech and will be moderating today's discussion with Emily Lattie. Throughout the session, I encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A function. We're going to leave about 15 minutes at the end to address some of those with Emily and Tim. So yeah, Tim, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Claire. And excited to be here today. Yeah, therapist in tech has been a journey for me. I feel like I got in on the ground floor maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, I feel like, and it's grown exponentially during that time. So we're probably at about 4,000 people. It is free to join. It's a nonprofit organization. And really, its impetus was the growing number of clinicians, clinical researchers, clinical scientists that were interested in careers in industry, but they just didn't have great models of what or how to get those kinds of jobs. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested in kind of clinically writ large kinds of positions in industry settings to give it a look. There's a Slack space where people post jobs and resources. It's a great source of support. And we're about to kick off, and kind of nicely timed with what's going on today, another wave of mentoring sessions. So I would encourage folks to hop over to Therapist in Tech and join that space. But what I'm really excited to do today is to both introduce and then have a conversation with Dr. Emily Lattie, who's a licensed clinical psychologist and the director of clinical product at Lyra Health. In her past life before joining Lyra, she was on faculty at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine, where she led federally funded research in the design and implementation of technology-enabled mental health services. So with that, I will, I guess, summon or welcome Emily to the front room here.
I am
There we go.
It's
All
nice.
right. It's always beautiful when technology works.
It's so cool.
Yeah. All right, well, I'll start with maybe just kind of a nice intro question of just what got you interested in the digital health industry in general.
Yeah. So I could talk about that for 45 minutes and I'll try to keep my answer brief so we have time to pull on other things. Right out of college, I knew that I wanted to get a PhD in clinical psychology, and the research assistant job that I got was at Northwestern, working under David Moore, who's become such an icon in the field over the years. And I got to work as a research assistant on some of his early studies of telephone delivered therapy and internet-based CBT programs, and just got really excited about the possibility of how digital mental health could expand the reach of evidence-based mental health treatment. And so I went to graduate school to focus on health psychology and remote delivered mental health interventions. And I honestly always assumed I would go into some kind of industry setting at some point, because that's where the impact seemed to be. But at the time that I was graduating with my PhD, I felt like I still really had a lot to learn. And I also really wanted to live in Chicago, which is where I'm from. And so I kind of lucked out on being able to get a spot back at Northwestern as a postdoc and then as a faculty member. Learned a ton, and the pace of academic research in digital mental health can be slow sometimes. And I have a ton of respect for people who can really dive deeply into it. But it kind of the impact and the reach was what was motivating me more. And so industry roles were for a while in the future, and then it wound up working out.
Yeah, great. And when you think about your graduate training, postdoctoral training, what were some of the things you picked up along the way that made it easier to transition from an academic research to an industry position?
You know, one of the things that I think was particularly helpful for transitioning into an industry position was when I was a graduate student researcher, I was, some people would say maybe I wasn't focused enough. I worked in a lot of different labs. I got excited about a lot of different things. Like I worked under my primary advisor throughout the 4 years that I was on campus, but I did a lot of other stuff. And I learned a lot during graduate research time about what at that time we were referring to as like multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary teams. And in the industry side, we talk about like cross-functional teams. And I think that since kind of from the beginning of my research time, I was working with people with really diverse training backgrounds, with really kind of different areas of expertise to tackle the kind of problems that I was interested in. That was probably one of the biggest things that really helped me be able to work effectively in the next kind of environment as well.
Yeah. And then maybe taking the kind of opposite perspective, what was maybe something that you wish you had in your training or something that you wish you had picked up that would have made it easier to make that transition?
Yeah. I think I was really lucky for not necessarily, there are a lot of great training opportunities in graduate school and postdoc, but I think I got really great training during my faculty time at Northwestern because I was on a K award, a career development award, and I had a lot of time built in for career support program stuff. And so something that I felt like I didn't get during graduate school was much of an introduction to just like the basics of how businesses work.
Yeah.
I had very little understanding of that. But while I was at Northwestern, I was able to take advantage of a program at our business school that was business for scientists and engineers, and that really helped with kind of some of the basics. And then while I was on faculty, I got to do things like a year-long leadership fellowship and a public voices fellowship, which taught me a lot about the value of storytelling and different types of expertise and stuff like that. And those were things that I feel like have been really helpful and really critical at some points to like the successes that I've been able to have in my role that I wish could have been more of a integrated part of training a bit earlier instead of the kind of bonus things that I was seeking out as a junior faculty member.
Yeah. So maybe tell us a little bit about Lyra as a company, how it works, what its business model is, and then maybe a little bit about your role and kind of what you do there.
Yeah. So Lyra is a global workforce mental health company. And in kind of the simplest terms, the business is that we sell mental health benefits to other companies. And so our clients, depending on the configuration that their HR team has selected, they get a certain number of free therapy and mental health coaching sessions as part of their employee benefits. They get access to all of our self-care kinds of tools, and they get access to some different specialty programs and care navigation services and some workplace training programs and that sort of thing. My position is called Director of Clinical Product. I work on the clinical product team, and one of the big parts of our team is designing and developing the tools that our therapists and coaches use with clients. I also do a fair amount of working closely with our product and design teams on other parts of our platform that isn't directly in care, but will like get people connected to care. I do some work more as like a subject matter expert in certain parts of our experience to work with like marketing and sales on how to make sure that we're appropriately pitching the great work that's going on. And then because I came in with a lot of research experience, and I really love doing research. And one of the core values at Lyra is following the science and making sure that everything is connecting back to best practices. I run both qualitative and mixed methods research studies, some of which are intended to be more generalizable and we published in peer review journals, and some of which are intended to scope future kind of product strategy decisions.
Hmm. And maybe kind of following that thread, can you say a little bit of what, and I imagine there's not a consistent day in the life, but just generally the kinds of things that you might do in the course of a day in your role?
Yeah. Um, I I honestly feel like a lot of times my days feel fairly similar to when I was a faculty member in that I'm in and out of meetings talking about different projects and initiatives. I spend some time actively writing, and some of the writing that I do is going to be client facing content that will get like rolled out into different tools. I spend some time reviewing and giving feedback on other people's work, and then I spend a decent amount of time in both like strategy and execution kind of meetings, which remind me quite a bit of when I was at Northwestern before I left to come to Lyra. I was working on probably 6 or 7 different grants. And so it was a lot of hopping from project to
Mhm.
project. It feels pretty similar a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe on that one, because I know in my own experience, there was certainly a transition of just like some things felt very familiar, and I was surprised by like how much an industry job like didn't feel that different in some respects than the academic research job I had, but in some ways felt very different. And I'm curious, what parts feel familiar, like you were just talking about, like kind of hopping or kind of wearing different hats, working on different projects, but what parts maybe felt new or different or unique to kind of more of an industry setting?
Yeah. I think one of the big things that felt different when I first jumped over to my current role was the pace of timelines. And it wasn't, I think I had been warned, like quote unquote warned by a lot of people, like everything moves so much faster in industry. And sometimes it did. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't in my role. And so I felt like a lot of times, particularly in my last couple of years as faculty, there were a lot of like, oh, we know there's going to be the rush up to this grant submission cycle, or we know that when we get this just in time response, there's going to be a lot of urgency to do this, or we've been waiting for 5 months for IRB review. And once it
Yeah.
finally happens, we're so behind that we like really need to like push and stretch to get something out there. And the pace of my current job has some very quick and some much much more kind of thoughtful, steadily paced work.
Hmm.
But I think that was a big adjustment from where I had been. Because I think a lot of my work in academia felt like it was one of those like hurry up and then wait. So like hurry up,
Yeah.
hit this special issue deadline to hit this grant deadline to get the IRB in, and then wait a long time. And there are definitely like high priority asks that come up from time to time, and that's what I was expecting a lot of. But it has felt oftentimes like there's kind of more consistency in what's being
Yeah.
taken on, and it's nice to be able to, you know, map out a quarter and then sometimes pivot during that quarter, but it doesn't feel like the same degree of
Yeah.
huge waiting uncertainty that a lot of my academic work had had.
Yeah, no, that certainly sounds sounds familiar. Uh, one thing for me was just like there had like when I was contemplating leaving academic research and joining an industry job, there were these like certain, I guess, like stereotypes, or maybe I'll call them misconceptions about what it meant to work in industry, and as set against kind of the values that we held as academic researchers. And certainly through experience and exposure, I kind of came to realize that a lot of those preconceived notions that maybe were told to me that I internalized just weren't true. And I'm curious if you had a similar experience of just things that you thought or things that you heard that when you kind of, left and made your kind of career transition, you realized actually, these aren't true, or actually the way that you're doing your job and the values you hold are highly transferable to the job you have.
Yeah, I feel like in the particular job that I have, the values that I hold and the skills that I have
Yeah.
been really transferable. One of the one of the big things that I felt like I often heard during my couple of years of faculty where I was like, oh, this is going really well. Grants are hitting. I don't think
Yeah.
I want to do this forever. So I'm not sure where I'm gonna like when an off ramp will be. Um, was that in industry positions, you have very little control over what you're going to work on. And I think that is true of some jobs, but it is not true of all jobs. And I was also feeling as I was stayed in my faculty research role for longer, which was great for so many different reasons. But that it wasn't as if, particularly I think because I was in a soft money medical school environment, it wasn't as if I was just working on whatever I wanted to work on any given day.
Yeah.
I was working on research that was fundable and that we had funding to do and that we were, be held to the funders to get that specific project done. Um, and so there's different levels of flexibility in different positions, but I haven't found that to be a huge contrast the way that I feel like people kind of warned me about when I was a graduate student or postdoc and was expressing
Yeah.
some industry curiosity.
Yeah. Earlier, you mentioned kind of cross-functional, and you drew the kind of comparison to kind of interdisciplinary, which maybe more academic-leaning folks might be more familiar with that term. But I do feel like the cross-functional work within an industry job is different in some respects. And I'm curious, because it's also one of my favorite things about now having made my transition, is like it's the thing
Yeah.
that gives me energy and that I love. But maybe for the audience and just for edification, can you talk a little bit more about cross-functional work and kind of what that looks like for you at Lyra?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So when I was in academic spaces, the interdisciplinary work, for a while I worked on psychoneuroimmunology stuff. So some of the interdisciplinary
Yeah.
work was like with immunologists and MDs and stuff like that. When I was finishing up my academic time, my interdisciplinary work was primarily with people with human-centered design research backgrounds and informatics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so in terms of the like training backgrounds, they were fairly similar when I hopped into my Lyra role, and the way that projects are structured and scoped feels very different.
Yeah.
And so in my academic interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work, there would still typically be a PI or
Mhm.
co-PIs who were like, responsible for all decisions
Yeah.
that were being made. Whereas in the space that I'm in my current role, there will, typically be someone who's driving that project. But they're not, I think because of the size of the company too, we're not like in a very small startup. They're not the people, they're not the person who's in charge of everything. And so there are messages that come in,
Yeah.
and pivots that happen kind of from multiple angles. And I think that was something that was a little bit confusing to adjust to sometimes of the,
Yeah.
oh, well, the like four people who are assigned to do this thing, we've reached consensus, but oh wait, no, there's a reason to pivot because of this other thing that I didn't run
Yeah.
into in academic research.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the things I end up talking to folks a lot about that are contemplating changing, is like that I call it science in a business setting, where it's like there's like use like how do you do your best job while also acknowledging that certain decisions are out of your control? Because I feel like in a lab, like you are like if you're the PI, like you're the CEO of your project. You get to make the
Right.
calls. And when you're in you work for a for-profit company, it's like, nope, there are other people that get to make business calls. And so your
Right.
job is to be flexible. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that I think I like knew in concept going in and was part of it was something that I really wanted and I liked the
Yeah.
idea of. I'm somebody who's very passionate about learning and team stuff. And I thought like, oh, coming into a company like this, there's going to be so much to learn. And I noticed, internal tension come up every so often of the like, oh, but I used to just be able to say, I'm the decision maker and this is done. And it
Yeah.
wasn't always the most impactful work then either. And so it's really, I think, been kind of fun and interesting to be in that different flexible model here.
Yeah. And if you think back to your training and just knowing that some folks in the audience may be in a position where they might be able to pick certain courses or make certain decisions in their training, were there particular things that you learned, particular courses that you feel like in your role now you're still going back to and are just grateful that you had that foundational training at the time that you did?
That's such a good question. I think if I think back to grad school specifically, I really appreciated a lot of my like non-specialty courses for that. And so I kind of knew in grad school, I went to a program that was a clinical health psychology program. And I remember not wanting to take things like
Yeah.
developmental psychology and social psychology because it wasn't the exact research I'm doing. And once I was in those classes, being like, oh,
Yeah.
there's so much to think about here. And I still go back to things that I learned in some of those more general or
Yeah.
yeah, they're not like for specialized classes that weren't my specialty, so to speak. Uh,
Yeah.
Another thing that I remember being really helpful in graduate school was the program that I was in because there was a medical school that we didn't share a campus with, but we spent some time with. There were these events where students from different health professional programs could come together to like do a little project or learn about a thing. And I remember it being so useful just to spend time with people who were being trained in other aspects of healthcare delivery
Yeah.
to like think about both like what makes them tick, what they're incentivized for, and that sort of thing. And that was really useful at the grad student level. Um, Once I was in postdoc and at Northwestern in my early faculty time too, I thought it was tremendously helpful to do the little bit of business school training that I was able to do, leadership program stuff, which was put on by somebody who does like really awesome executive coaching things. That
Yeah.
was great. Other things that I thought were really helpful was being pushed a little bit outside of my immediate comfort zone in postdoc and early faculty time to go to conferences and do workshops at conferences that weren't my like home base. And so going to ACM Chi, which is the Human Computer Interaction Conference, and hear how HCI folks were talking about mental health and like doing mental health workshops there was so cool. Getting more into the dissemination and implementation science world,
Hmm.
those like workshops and trainings were also super helpful. So I think really like
Yeah.
taking myself outside of the like, I am the clinical psychologist who understands and is passionate about like these mechanisms of care, all the opportunities that I had to work more at different systems levels, I think were the things that have stuck with me and the things that I feel like I use a lot more in my
Yeah.
day to day now.
Yeah, yeah, that plus one on the business thinking. It turns out there's a lot of things there that you just don't if unless you go after it, like you're not naturally going to be exposed to it in your graduate training more than likely. And I think for me also it was just people management, like how to be a good manager, because it's very different when it's RAs that maybe are volunteering their time for course credit. It's like, well, like the stakes are very different when someone's livelihood depends on this and you're trying to guide them into your points earlier, like in a, volatile, well-intended, chaotic environment where things are changing and you're trying to kind of provide a good, steady force for the people that report into you. So yeah,
Yeah.
great, great points.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of fun things.
No. Well, I'm sure, for the folks on the call, they'll be very interested in this question, which is like when you're asked the question of like, what should I be doing? What advice can you bestow based on your experience now, kind of having made a successful transition, leading the clinical product work at Lyra? What advice do you give to people that might be interested in similar career paths or making similar transitions?
Yeah. One of the big things that I come back to a lot is that, I mean, this sounds demotivating all because I love the jobs that I've had, but like jobs are jobs and no job is probably going to be a forever job. And so thinking about, looking for industry jobs or making a transition from an academic to an industry position, I think I might have spent more time than that I like needed to trying to figure out what is it exactly that I want to do, what exactly will be helpful. Because there are a lot of job opportunities, but they can also feel very kind of few and far between, especially if you're specialized in a
Yeah,
specific area. And so I really encourage people to think through what are the aspects of work that they really care about, and what are more of the nice to have kind of things to help guide some initial searches. And I personally knew like, oh, I don't want to move out of Chicago.
yeah,
That wasn't when I was at Northwestern and was thinking about what else I might want to do. It was there's not a lot of businesses right here in Chicago, and so my options seem looking for remote jobs or looking at other institutions in the Chicago area. And I
yeah,
know when I was more junior, things like being geographically restricted was like very frowned upon.
yeah,
And as an adult human now, I'm like, that's life. Like
yeah,
people can have preferences and priorities in that way. Um, I know for some folks, the having more autonomy and leadership is really what's valued and is what's key. And there can be really great academic ways to be able to do that, and there can be industry ways to do that too. And I've seen some people be uh, kind of unhappy too, like making the switch over to industry and then feeling
yeah,
like the particular job that they got didn't match with what they valued. And so I try not to think of it as a like academic jobs or industry jobs, but like there's so many within both of those
yeah,
buckets to be able to think through like what actually matters, um, at least for the next year, next couple of years, and
yeah.
try to pull on that rather than like focusing on breaking into something, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, great. And something you said earlier that I'll also just kind of draw back because I think it's part of the advice I tend to give people is like, I know when I was in my academic research days, like I had collaborators, people that I enjoyed working with, but I didn't take networking as seriously. But I have learned that it's a very different thing once you kind of cross over because I have now had the good fortune of like three of the four jobs I've had in industry have been because of direct people that I've worked with that were able
Yeah.
to like recommend me internally for the company. So
Mhm.
for folks out there that are early thinking about like building your network, I know LinkedIn can be a little cringy at times, but it is a good place to meet people and something like TNT or Tide are great institutions for finding like-minded individuals, finding people that have made this transition, and attending this seminar series of just being able to learn and hear about people's experiences.
Yeah, yeah, definite plus one to LinkedIn and being involved in communities. I feel like I saw sometimes on the academic side where networking and being on committees at conferences and stuff like that did help get people a leg up in getting postdocs or getting faculty positions and stuff like that, because
Yeah.
humans are social creatures and we like to
Yeah.
work with people that we know are going to be good to work with. um and it does seem to matter a lot more for being able to find
Yeah.
jobs in the industry space. And one of the things that I realized I had like no insight into until I'd been at Lyra for a little bit was just how many job applications come in for any given job posting. and how valuable it can be to have some sort of connection within the company sometimes to be able to like submit an internal recommendation for somebody. A lot of internal recommendations get submitted for job candidates that don't get interviews because there's
Yeah.
just huge numbers. But if you know somebody who works at a company, or you've, met them at a conference, or you've been
Yeah.
part of a career development panel or something, reaching out and asking if they would feel comfortable submitting one of those can be really useful for getting applications looked at more closely in
Yeah.
midst of a competitive environment right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Here, here. The other thing I'll throw out there, because it was something that I didn't know much about, but I have subsequently learned a ton about, is just like the size and like the stage and maturity of a company also has a large bearing on what your life will look like there. So like for me, I didn't realize like the stages of funding, like the series, seed through kind of whatever letter until someone goes public. But how specialized your role is there, versus like how much breadth you'll have to kind of take on new responsibilities. And where, remind me, where is Lyra in like it's kind of like funding? It's not, is it public?
It is, Lyra is not
All right,
public,
okay.
but when I joined, they had already raised Series G funding, and so
Series G, there you go. Say
yeah,
it can.
if I joined at a time where it was already very large,
Yeah,
and as you're referencing, my role was a lot more scoped than
yeah,
some of my colleagues who around the time I was seeing join companies, which were more in the, like 5 to 20 employee space, where they were wearing a lot of different hats. And
yep,
in some ways that seemed really fun and like really motivating. And I that wasn't what I wanted at that point. I wanted
yep,
a controlled job to learn about a big business. And yeah, that is a
yeah,
big difference. That the same job title can mean really
yes.
radically different things depending on things like the size of the company and where
Yeah.
they are in growth.
Yeah, which is a fair point too, because if you're thinking about the arc of a career, it's like there's something to like the title you're seeking, what you're expecting, and kind of how you think your career can grow from there. But well, I see we have a few questions trickling in now, which is great. So I will, can you see them, Emily, on your end or no?
Yes, I
Okay,
can.
perfect. All right, so I don't have to, you don't have to memorize what I'm saying. So we'll kind of take them in order here then. So with the increased saturation of PhDs in the digital mental health industry, do you think having industry experience is more important?
I do think having some kind of industry experience is more important now that there are so many, particularly like clinical psych PhDs in the digital mental health space. I was so delighted that TYDE was able to put together the summer internship program this year. And when I first joined Lyra, I had asked right away, like, am I going to be allowed to hire interns? Because I was sad about losing some of my
Yeah,
training time from Northwestern, and I have been able to. I think things like trying to find relevant internships or trying to get connected for even relatively brief consulting opportunities on things that you might have specialty expertise in, or if you're a strong writer and you're looking at content writing kind of things, that can be really impactful, not just for looking competitive for the next job, but really I think for your own career development and growth of
yeah,
like, is this a thing that I want to be doing? Or being able to get more insight into, oh, this is how a company is structured, or like this is how
yeah.
some of these teams work with one another. I think it can be really useful to get some of that on the ground experience to help suss out later, like, what do I actually want to be doing
Yeah.
next?
And it also just helps with learning the lingo of like how people talk, like just being able to wrap your head around that. The other thing I'll say that it's a trend I've been kind of observing over the last maybe year or so as funding in, particularly the startup environment has been a bit more challenging, is just the rise of fractional positions. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for people at different levels of experience to take on more limited, like I guess, like even smaller than a part-time. So you could maybe get, to your point, Emily, experience in a lower stakes way, but you could stack a couple of these at different companies. And so it's a way to kind of dip your toe and get a feel for what stage and size of company, what kind of role is most appealing for you. So certainly, I think given the challenges that the person here is asking in their question, like there are new opportunities that I think are coming to bear to kind of meet the moment.
Yeah, I'm remembering now that when I was still on faculty, some of the most helpful things that I had done that I think prepared me for this role too was being on a couple of stakeholder advisory boards or scientific advisory boards for companies to kind of just learn more about what was working, and then doing a little bit. It was very light. It was like maybe 2 hours a week of research consulting for a large company for a while. And it was really neat to be able to see how I could apply some of my clinical
Yeah,
research skills. And then I think I also just learned so much about like how a research team could be positioned and where, what kind of questions they had to go ask other teams after our meetings and what kind of permissions were in place. And all of those things I think really
yeah,
shape um, my job search when I did do a job search and the kinds of roles that I was more interested in.
yeah. So I'll just take them in the order they come in. So as someone with an MSc degree who's finding it challenging to break into industry, I'm wondering, given the current trend of academics pivoting into industry roles and the growing skepticism about long PhD commitments, what would you recommend for someone like me to become more competitive without a PhD? And in your view, is pursuing a PhD still worthwhile for someone ultimately aiming for an industry career? Ooh,
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this where I take this is how I was saying earlier, I don't see things so clearly as like academic versus industry, as there's really big spectrums within each type of employment sphere. And in terms of an industry career, a PhD can be, it can be what's required for certain kinds of industry research roles. It as a clinical psychologist myself, I a lot of my job at Northwestern, I wasn't in clinical practice there as a clinical researcher, but I did some side private practice work, and it turned out that was like really key for the job that I have now, that I had kept up my license and my clinical training to do the kind of work that I do now. And so like if you're looking for something that's really clinically applied, being a licensed mental health provider is going to be a big unlock for certain types of roles too. There's a lot of people I've seen who have industry careers that, they are in research or data science, that are at the master's level, or they're working in operations within a company, or I've seen people pivot to be more on the partnership and sales kinds of sides too. And so I think it really depends on what type of roles look interesting, and look valuable and in line with what somebody's really looking for in their career arc, to make that determination of like what kind of training is needed to get
yeah.
that kind of role.
Yeah, and I think if I put on like my hiring manager hat, I do feel like the place, given a very competitive job landscape, like as a hiring manager, like it's never been more competitive. Like, I mean, you put a job out there and so many people that are qualified, overqualified are applying for it. So I think the hardest challenge or the trade-off there is like just like the competitiveness. And despite I mean I wish this wasn't true, but we're still in a world where degrees are just box checking matters with respect to getting from like that huge stack of applications into that first round. So I think the degree probably matters more for earlier stage or entry level jobs coming out of your training. Because
Yeah.
I think once you have the experience speaks for itself. But I do feel like there is that kind of like that, just like getting that first opportunity and using that to sell yourself through your experience.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I've Next question. I recently completed a master's with coursework in statistics, user experience, human computer interaction, and psychological research. I'm curious, do you see being a generalist as an advantage? Oof. in the digital health industry, how might someone with interdisciplinary interests think about positioning themselves in their job search?
So I I am probably a little bit biased as someone who's a bit more of a generalist myself too. I think being a generalist is an advantage oftentimes in that there's probably a lot of types of roles that you could be really happy and fulfilled in.
Yeah.
And in order to look competitive for certain positions, the application has to be tailored to that position specifically. And
Yeah.
so I know of people who have simultaneously been applying to jobs that are more on the stat side and other jobs that are more on the UX research kind of side. And can it can be very overwhelming. Some people, if they're continuously pitching themselves as a generalist, it can be hard to get interviews. But if you can develop application materials and develop your like public facing uh, presence as I have deep expertise in this specific thing that you want, that can open up more doors too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think this is where a stage of company also looms
Yeah.
large. If you're like employee number three, they're probably thrilled that you can occupy multiple roles, advance work on multiple fronts, and kind of
Yeah,
leverage those varied skills. But if you're employee 30,000 and they're like, we need you to do this very specific thing in this vertical where your role is very defined, the breadth of skills may not be as important as the depth in any one area you're being hired for.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. What experiences, degrees, qualifications do industry positions involving clinical research look for? I am preparing to apply for graduate school and considering different types of programs, PhD versus master's. Thank you.
I think it depends. I have seen I have seen a lot of clinical research positions that are at the PhD level, and I have also seen clinical research positions that are at the master's degree level. I think it's hard to break into clinical research kind of roles at a company without having one of those types of degrees. Um, but it seems like it really depends on like the specific role in the program. I'm wondering
Yeah.
if you have other kind of guidance there, Tim.
I think what I was amazed by, and I had no real bearing on this, and it's only gotten more nuanced, I think, in the, 7-ish years I've been working in this space. It's just the number of clinical roles that exist. Like when
Yeah.
I was hired at my first job, it was because of my background in serious mental illness. And so I was a subject matter expert, a clinical subject matter expert, building a digital therapeutic for people of schizophrenia, a
Yeah.
one-to-one map of what I was doing and what they needed from me. But
Yeah.
there's clinical operations, which is more like the conduct of research at different levels of scale. There's clinical data science roles. So I feel like what's been interesting is the rise of these more intersectional experiences of like, I am a trained clinician, plus I'm really good at this, and then kind of like building a bridge of like, I can do it through my clinical experience. I also can do this really well and from an informed perspective. But it kind of like, you kind of have to be thinking about like, what again, I think you brought this up earlier, which I really resonated with me is like what gives you energy, like what brings you joy, like
Yeah.
what are your values? Because like it's your job. Like you
Yeah.
have to love it, but you should like what you do. It makes it a lot easier. So it's kind of like if I have an inkling of that, like trying to find the right training and then kind of getting familiar with what are the jobs out there and what are they asking of their applicants? Like if you want a job and then you aren't choosing the right level of training or requirements, like you're not setting yourself up, your future self up for success, I should say.
Yeah, no, I love that point. One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking about some of the different types of roles is there have been a few points where I've like learned more about different kind of analytics positions where
Mhm.
I think like, oh, if I would have known about that as a undergrad, I could see myself having gone more in that kind of direction of like, I'm also really energized
Yeah.
by like using data to create efficiency. and to like uncover where pain points
Yeah.
are. And there's so many different things that I think folks with like strong research minds and strong research training can do in a really big variety of industry kind of environments that aren't necessarily the like, when I was coming from Northwestern, it was I develop and test and disseminate digital mental health interventions for this. But a lot of the like, questions about how to, expand care or improve provider quality of life in certain domains and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of roles that get at those kinds of questions too,
Yeah.
in ways that you may not need a PhD to do that kind of role, but I think can be really rewarding and is
Yeah.
really interesting research in its own kind of way.
Yeah, and then we haven't talked about the just like the inflection point moment we're living in of just AI and large language models and how that's going to bend like 10 years from now, like where will we be and like predicting like what's going to make you competitive for the positions of the future. There's like a whole other we don't have enough time on this call to get into that, but that's a
I'm so happy you're
loom
bringing that up
large.
because that's
Yeah.
been one of my big points lately when folks have been like, what kind of school should I go to next? And I'm like, the job market right now is so different than the job market was 3 years ago that I don't feel like I can give great advice about what it's
Yeah.
going to look like in another 3 to 5 to 7 years
Yeah.
either. And so that's where I go back a lot to the like, what brings you energy? What motivates you? A job doesn't have to be perfect, but you should like it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, going back to training, how important is getting a postdoc before applying for industry positions?
I think it really depends on what kind of industry position somebody's going to and what kind of work they want to be doing long term. And so I tend to encourage folks, since I'm from a clinical psych background, of if you liked clinical work in any way, shape, or form, like having a clinical degree opens up so many kinds of doors, and being licensed opens up so many kinds of doors. And so doing a postdoc it's key to be licensed in most
Yeah.
states. And so having a postdoc for clinical purposes is great. Having a postdoc for deeper research kind of training, I think can be really valuable. But I think it is often more valuable for somebody's kind of individual career development than for like a hiring manager definitely making a decision. Postdocs can open
Yeah.
up a lot of additional training opportunities. It can give people more insights into the ways different things work. Switching systems that you're doing work in, I think really helps open your eyes to the kinds of systems that like you do and don't want to work in, and can help you pay attention to more process kind of stuff. I think it really depends on like what the next position is for you. What
Yeah.
are your takes
Yeah.
on that?
I think I largely agree. I someone that did a postdoc but then did not get licensed despite doing all the work for it. But my wife, who I met in grad school, did get her license after doing her postdoc, and then subsequently left her postdoc at the VA to work in the digital mental health industry. So it's also nice to just have a fallback in a world where there is just more volatility. Like we don't have the notion of tenure in industry. Like you work at your employer's discretion, and sometimes as things happen like people are out of work, and so having a fallback or having something that you can do and kind of titrate up or down just to kind of keep some stability, I think it is also a consideration. And just like I know from my own experience, like postdocs are a great opportunity to learn something new. It's like that last chance to like take on a new specialization or do something in like a somewhat safe environment. So depending on what you want out of your career, it might be a great opportunity to focus on something, build up a good experience base, work at a company, kind of dip a toe into industry while still having all the options of pursuing an academic career or transitioning out. So it's a nice opportunity to explore if you're in a position to take advantage of that.
Yeah, one of the things I remember I had really appreciated when I was mentoring postdocs at the T32 that I helped run at Northwestern was a like conceptualizing the postdoc time is time to get training so that you can get another job.
Yeah.
And it's really training for your next job. Sometimes it's academic jobs, sometimes it's industry jobs. And I saw people who knew that they were interested in industry positions get to use a decent amount of their postdoc time too to learn more about industry positions and to do networking during a time where like they had time during the business day too, instead of always having to squeeze things in after
Yeah.
something else. So there could be perks, but isn't like a hard and fast, you have to do it this way or this way, because the job market's weird.
Yeah. Uh, to this point, which I think was referring to our previous conversation, how do you recommend finding these fractional, less than part-time positions, direct connections, cold emails, etc.?
That's a great question. My understanding is some of them happen through direct connections and networking with folks who you know are very early in developing a company.
Yeah.
They can also, I think, come from if you're getting connected with folks who have already been successful in building up their own consulting practices to be able to to give the heads up of like, hey, if there are things coming to you that you don't have bandwidth, capacity, interest in, please know that this is something that I'm interested in starting to do also, to just kind of use the networking to get referrals yourself.
Yeah.
But I haven't pursued that firsthand. And so I don't know ins and
Yep.
outs of it. Do you have more insights into that?
Yep. I know there's, and it's the site is eluding me, but there is a site that if you search like fractional jobs, like there is now like a clearinghouse site that kind of will look at
Oh,
this and like just pull in. So I think that's people more proactively looking for folks
mhm.
in fractional positions. But otherwise, yeah, I think this is another example of networking where I mean, I think the interesting thing about this is it also is like again, it's like something we weren't trained to do of like how to negotiate because you're almost kind of entering into like a contract position. So like
Yeah.
negotiating your rate, which I tend not to think about myself and like because I'm so used to being a salaried employee. They're like, well, what's the hourly rate that I can choose is a whole other thing. But
Yeah.
it's like depending on kind of your comfort, I think it is the opportunity to use your network. It can be a low stakes way to kind of if someone's maybe thinking about there's going to be a role, but we're kind of wanting to bring someone in and almost audition them. It's like a low stakes way to kind of see if it's a right fit for you. So yeah, I think it's the network plus like there's increasingly more formality around like where these positions are posted.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, we got a last one. I guess I'll read it out loud since to keep us going. I see a lot of roles for clinicians in digital health that seem primarily designed as guardrails, ensuring care is delivered, checking boxes, and maintaining what's considered, quote, valid. Meanwhile, any innovation that does happen often seems to be limited to the business side, with clinicians brought in mainly to validate or bless what's already been built. But from my perspective, the concept of validity itself often feels outdated. If every new idea must first be cross-validated against legacy scales, we're just recreating old limitations in shinier packaging. Do you agree with this general appraisal? And if so, how might someone who sees themselves more as a thinker, innovator than a traditional clinical expert get involved in actually building something new? I love it.
Yeah. I I see different companies work in really different ways around this. And so I my eyes get drawn first to the somebody who sees themselves more as a thinker, innovator, get involved in building something new. I think that is a like get in on the ground floor at a startup, find co-founders
Yeah,
who can help bring a business a business structure to life. Um I think that there are some companies that are driven more by folks who are coming in primarily with a business background, and they are hiring clinicians to, I wouldn't necessarily say bless what's already been built, but I think I've seen in some companies more like kind of fine tune
Mhm.
to ensure that what then gets delivered is going to be, appropriate, safe, helpful to people, all of those good things. Um,
Yeah.
different. I've seen different groups handle validity in different ways. I do see innovation coming out, and there are often, um, to like raise additional funds or to sell to certain groups.
Yeah.
There are often benchmarks to show that this is as effective as this type of care. And that I think is really to help people make decisions of going in on something new.
Yeah.
But again, ranging from, like two-person startups to companies with thousands and thousands of employees. I think clinicians get brought in different ways.
Yeah.
And I know, Tim, you've worked in a variety of companies now. If you
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
immediate
I mean,
insights for that one.
yeah, this is near and dear to my heart because it's like the
Yeah.
central tension of my career of like wanting to push and innovate, but also being subject to just like where things are just writ
Yeah.
large. And I think about like I've worked, prior to my current role at digital therapeutics companies, building software subject to regulation by regulatory bodies. And it's hard when you're trying to disrupt healthcare, ostensibly. Like, hey, like we're gonna fundamentally change we do this. Like, great, who's going to adopt it? And in a world where like it's a business and the business needs to be viable, it's like you need to kind of, it's like the slow change from within a system versus trying to assault it with innovation from the outside. And it's hard because it can be very frustrating when you see like, why are we using the PHQ when we have these tools at our disposal that can do much more granular, ecologically valid assessments of human behavior? It's like, well, like these systems still use these things. And so I think it's the right idea and spirit of just like wanting to push, seeing where the kind of like the inefficiencies are and wanting to make it better. But it's like the cruel reality of business is that it's hard to get systems of like, yeah, it's not perfect, but it works for us to adopt and kind of incorporate this change. And you're starting to see it with some of the AI tools where there is some uptake on the clinical side of like new ways of doing things, particularly when it comes to progress notes or just like ways to make like the administrative parts of sessions a little bit more efficient. So you are seeing some change, but it's hard to get these entrenched bodies to see things differently. It takes a lot of willpower, a lot of evidence, a lot of kind of cost savings or economic data, and so it's hard to do it. It's not impossible. I love the question, but it is hard, and I get where the question is coming from. No.
Perfect.
Yeah. Emily, anything, last thoughts, wisdom to bestow upon the audience here?
Ooh. I always just want to come back to like what jobs. There are so many different kinds of jobs, and pay attention to what like fills your cup. What are the energizing parts of work? And so thinking through what kinds of jobs there are out there that people are enthusiastic about, that can come in a whole lot of different kind of shapes and sizes and can really depend on individual companies too.
Yeah.
And so the job market is tricky right now,
Yeah.
but I have a lot of optimism that there will continue to be growth and there'll continue to be really good roles coming out for people with all different types of training. So I appreciate being able to spend a little time today with you, Tim, and to talk
Yeah.
to this group and look forward to learning more.
Yeah. Here, here. Yeah. And thank you for your time, Emily, and thanks everyone for joining.
Yep. Have a good day, all.
All right. See ya.